The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Toby Manhire with a bonus extra pop-up episode of Gone by Lunchtime. I'll be back in a few days with Annabelle Lee Mather, Ben Thomas, and your regular installation of piping hot takes, stone cold truths and hyper-extended metaphors. But today, just over a fortnight out from the Australian election, we thought we'd take a quick virtual trip across the Tasman Sea to hear how the campaign is shaping up. If you're a member already, thank you. If you're member curious, please click through on the spin-off and support us to keep making independent, homegrown, paywall-free journalism. It's May the 4th, 2022, and a moment ago I called up real-life Australian Ben McKay. He's the Crocodile Dundee, the Don Bradman, the Kath and the Kim of the Press Gallery in Wellington, from where he reports for the Australian Associated Press. But right now, he is in his home of Tasmania, holidaying somewhere up the coast. We talked about the state of the race, the Scomo versus Albo contest, the peculiarities of the electoral system. We talked a bit about the teal wave, this new group of teal independents trying to get the green-blue vote, and a bit about the New Zealand versus Australia political and media culture. Enjoy. Kia ora, Ben. How are you? How is paradise? How is the mighty island state of Tasmania?
Yes, it's great. I have I've traversed up the coast up to a place called Freycinet. It's a national park.
Yes.
Staying at a lodge. We're going to go for a walk and hunt some, well, not hunt some, but try and find some wombats later.
Wow. That's real.
Yeah.
That sounds almost made up.
In between the research I've done for this podcast. And thanks for sending me over here for this. It helps with the preparation.
Well, we really wanted to find out what the mood was on the ground among the wombat community. Is there election fever among the wombats or the other good people of Tasmania?
I'll have to take the fifth on that. I haven't caught up with any wombats yet.
What about?
We'll do another podcast.
What about Tasmanians more generally, just the human variety?
Yes. I mean, there's also a local election down here at the same time in Australia's convoluted sort of government system. But I mean, Tasmania gets a lot of love this time of year because it has 2, potentially 3 swing seats of the 5. So there is election fever in Tasmania. Scott Morrison's been here this week, and it was the site of Albo's gaffe. I can't name the unemployment rate, can't name the cash rate gaffe from week 1, which you might remember.
Yes.
So Tasmania's on the map, baby. It's big.
So Anthony Albanese, Albo, versus Scott Morrison, Scomo. You've outlined some of that and the other words ending in O in an excellent piece for the spin-off, which people should have a read of. Albanese had a bit of COVID recently, but he's back on board and launched the campaign on the weekend, I think.
Yes, that's right. So he got out of COVID isolation just in time to head to Perth, where they think they can pick up some seats in Western Australia. Fairly stock standard campaign stuff. It's always notable who goes to these things and who doesn't. Yep. Albo had sat down with Kevin Rudd and Paul Keating, 2 Labor luminaries. Missing was Julia Gillard. That would have been the full set. But to be honest, Gillard doesn't really dig back into politics, into Australian politics, the work of this that much. She sort of focused on bigger, broader things these days. It wasn't too much for me.
It also featured the disembodied voice of Russell Crowe, I believe.
Did it? I did pick up a whisper of this. He's providing the voiceovers.
Yeah, he did the sort of a sort of slightly gladiator style, the challenge that faces the Australian people type, then a sort of slightly British Australian tenor. I mean, it was very moving.
I'm pleased to hear it. It's reasonably incongruous though with Albanese, isn't it? He's sort of a mild-mannered, almost a bureaucrat type these days is his style. But I imagine they have a friendship because Albanese says he has three faiths: the Catholic Church, the Australian Labor Party, and the South Sydney Rabbitohs. And of course, Rusty is one of the owners or the owner of the South Sydney Rabbitohs. So there's the friendship.
The bunnies. So Albanese this time round seems to be, tell me if I'm wrong about this, seems to be running a more cautious campaign than Bill Shorten did 3 years ago when the then Labor leader looked for all money as though a Labor government was going to be installed. Is it the case that this time around Albo and the rest of the Labor Party have been burnt by that experience and are running a more centrist, moderate, don't scare the horses type campaign?
Yes, I think that's right, although I wouldn't necessarily say the policy platform has changed so much. It's just what they're spruiking. Back last time around, well, I mean, the defining policy of last election was tax breaks. I'm trying to compute this into non-Australian language with the negative gearing and all that rubbish. Yeah. Basically, tax breaks for house homeowners, which would allow easier paths into buying a home. And of course, Morrison, the ruthless campaigner that he is, just picked it apart and it became a tax on the house. Other parts of the platform was a death tax, and combined that with a couple of regional factors, added up to a very narrow Labor loss. So it's not as if they were swept away. I mean, this government currently has 76 seats of 151 seats. It's very tight, which does change things. But Albanese is nothing. You wouldn't call him an inspiring leader, but he's certainly smart. So he spent the first part of this term going around to these regional places where Labor thinks they can pick up seats, selecting ex-mayors, liked people, people that can do well. And he's promoted the fact that this election isn't a sprint, and it's won in the fourth quarter, which is where we're at. Somewhat, wasn't great that he made that big blooper in week one, if he's saying that it's all coming down to the last 6 weeks. But the polling is in the position now that Labor can be, I think, more confident.
And the gaffe that you mentioned, or the brain fade, was when he couldn't remember what the OCR was, what the official cash rate. I think that's right. And yesterday in Australia, that was the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate. The big story yesterday in Australia, though, was an increase in interest rates for the first time in what seems like forever. I think it might have been even as long as 10 years that it's actually gone upwards from a very, very low point of 0.1, was it? Or something like that?
That's right.
By maybe a third of a point or something like that. And it's interesting because looking at it from here, the news is very similar but also different insofar as you have a government being blamed by the opposition for a cost of living crisis, struggle, for inflation, and for a rise in interest rates, which obviously hurts people in the hip pocket, which is a constant of Australian election rhetoric. The difference being that you've got in the Australian case, you've got the centre-left party having a go at the centre-right group.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I'm a student of Kiwi politics. I've obviously lived Australian politics. Do you guys get into moaning much? Are you guys into moaning about the government? Is that yes? Because I feel like that's pretty much what's going on both sides of the equation. Yeah. The difference being in Australia, like the economy is considered, as it would be here in New Zealand, I guess. The economy is considered the coalition, the Liberal Party's turf. So it's a tough sell for Labor to suggest we'll be better economic managers. That's what's happening. As you say, you're right. The same factors happening in Australia as New Zealand. Inflation is now over 5%. They're not quite the 6.9% New Zealand. Interest rates have gone up from 0.1 to 0.35. So it's not biting, but it is the first rise in a decade. It's actually the first rate rise in a campaign since 2007, which was the last time, I don't know if you're into omens, it was the last time the coalition flipped to Labor when Kevin Rudd came from Queensland and said he was here to help. And classically, it has provided a bit of a campaign refresh because we had the inflation figures last week, the interest rate rise yesterday, and on script, all of the papers have sort of put that classic sort of upset-looking couple, heterosexual couple outside their house. Maybe they're holding a baby, and they're worried about interest rates.
Yeah.
The exception to that was the West Australian, who had an old bloke in his stubby shorts, and the sort of lead-in headline was like, "I bought my house when it was 17% interest rate,"
Right.
and the headline is, "You call that a rate hike?" Which is just sensational. But it does tell the story that they are from very emergency level settings.
Yes.
So it's not as if people are leveraged. They've certainly got mortgages, but it's not runaway interest rates.
And you make the point that in some sense it suits Morrison and the coalition to have a conversation around the economy, doesn't it? Because much in the way that the National Party, no matter what happens here in New Zealand, the National Party here tends to be regarded by people as a more prudent hand on the tiller. That's the territory on which Morrison thinks he's most likely to win, by saying you can't trust this lot at a tricky time, yeah?
That is exactly right. So that's you've summarised Morrison's argument well. I think I saw recently he was framing it as in, you might not like me very much. You might not like us very much. We don't get everything wrong. Sorry, we don't get everything right. But who do you trust with the economic recovery? And Labor is trying just to tweak on that, saying, obviously they can be trusted. They point to their experience in the GFC that happened under Rudd, and Australia was one of the few countries to avoid a recession. Our miracle growth went along for 2 decades. But Albanese's argument is your wages aren't rising as fast as cost of living, which I think is an experience here as well. So they're saying, are things getting tougher? That's because for productivity, wages, we can fix that.
Yeah. Hey, let's just briefly sidebar on, because we're talking about the coalition and we're talking about the Liberals and you're talking about different layers of elections happening. Let's do
Have we assumed some knowledge?
Well, let's do a very quick... You covered this really well in your piece, which again I urge people to go and read on the Spin-Off website. It also includes some quite graphic cow-based metaphors which people might enjoy. But when we talk about the coalition, what does that mean?
Okay, so the coalition is a long-standing, I think it's up to 100 years of them coming together, agreement between the Liberals and the Nationals. The Liberals are the sort of inner-city sort of Liberal party of John Howard and the rest. The National are essentially their regional wing with a bit of, agrarian socialism. No, I shouldn't say that actually. They're the centre-right party of the bush.
Yeah.
But they're much more focused on previously farming issues and these days mining issues, which is a major dimension in Australia. Mining is sort of code for the economy doing well, and it's the key to a lot of swing seats where we might sort of mine coal and whatnot. Labor is obviously just the Labor Party. They tend to govern by themselves, unlike New Zealand.
Yeah.
There is some suggestion they may have to govern in coalition or cobble together in a hung parliament here, but it's basically a Labor versus Liberal National affair.
With National as much the smaller component part of the coalition, right?
Yeah, I think they have maybe 15 seats of their 76 in Canberra.
And the way that the system works, it's people who are older than 30 will remember first past the post in New Zealand. There isn't strictly a proportional element, but there is. Was it called preferential voting in each of the seats? Can you explain that?
I can. So the preferential element comes into it in the Senate. That's where, if 20% of the people vote for the Greens, they get roughly 20% of the Senate. In the House of Reps, that's the lower house, and that's where government is formed, and whoever gets 76 seats can form the government. So, and preferential voting, I've been trying my best to think of a very simple way to explain this, and it basically means your vote will count, but it might not be the one you voted for. It'll trickle down to one of the two most popular options. So if that makes sense, and that's almost usually the Labor Party or one of the coalition candidates in all of those 151 elections. The Greens are just polling. There was a poll out this week that had the Greens on 15%, which would obviously, in a proportional system like New Zealand, give them heaps of seats, like 25.
Yeah.
But they, in fact, have won the seat of Melbourne, because it's the only seat in the country that has enough left-wingers to get them over the line in that two-headed contest. I don't think I did a very good job of that.
Well, but basically on the polling paper, you rank your preferences, yes?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Which some people will know from some local body elections, different parts of New Zealand, but let's not go down that track. You mentioned the Senate, which people are elected on 6-year. It's a 6-year term, right? So roughly half,
that's
slightly
right.
more than half of those are up for election this time round.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And does that figure prominently or does that get lost a bit in the House election?
Completely lost.
Yep.
Yeah, completely lost. It's government's the main game. That's where everyone is focused on. There can be interesting results and things in the Senate, and there's a lot of trading that goes on to make sure your Senate place is high, so like a high list place. Because generally the top 2 from each party get elected, and the third place is you're unlikely to get a third person from each of the major parties elected. So if anyone drops to position 3, there's a bin fight, and that can generate headlines, but otherwise no. And like I think maybe 7 or 8 of the last 10 elections, there's always been a crossbench. So the Greens, the Democrats, some independent senators that hold the control of power, the balance of power. So it's very rare for the governments to have it all their own way, as Ardern's government does here currently.
And the last thing, compulsory voting, whereas in New Zealand you need to be on the electoral roll, but you're not required to vote. In Australia, you are.
Yes, that's right. So every person, it's technically worded here, not every person is required to vote. Everyone that's on the electoral roll is required to vote. And there's a big push to get, 17, 18, or 19-year-olds enrolled on the electoral roll. So then that sort of gets you into the system. I don't know. I can see the argument either way. I mean, is it undemocratic to ask someone to vote? I mean, I don't know how rigorous the enforcement system is to get, fine people if they don't vote. I think the fine was up to about $40 last time I checked if you don't vote. And
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if you're going to be locked away for that. So,
the much more important constitutional part of the encouragement to vote is the sausage sizzle, really, isn't it? That's an important tradition.
That's right. Yeah. I was actually quite surprised because New Zealand allowed me to vote. I was very grateful to be able to vote in the 2020 election when I was.
Yes, wouldn't be the same the other way around, would it? You have to be a citizen over there, I think.
No, no, it certainly wouldn't be. And I was walking, I almost walked past the ballot box because there was a polling place because there was nothing there. There was just one little wee sign saying, come on in. And no fanfare. I tried to take a picture of myself doing the ballot and I got tutted as well. Yeah. In Australia, it's a fundraising opportunity for schools. Schools and churches and everyone puts on their cake stands and there's often lines to vote and kids will, they can do entertainment and stuff. It's a big thing. It's a fun day.
Yeah.
For nothing else than your democracy sausage on the sausage sizzle.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komata o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
More prosaically, we talked about the economy, What are the other issues that are in the foreground? I've seen some. You don't normally see things like national security or climate change being front and centre, but both of those seem to have been around. Can you talk about those and anything else that's proving a pinch point?
Yeah, so the one thing that's popped up as a bit of a event that's changed the narrative of the election would be the Solomon Islands deal with China to provide security, which everyone then translates into the prospect of a Chinese security military base on Australia's doorstep. The Solomon Islands is less than 2,000 kilometres from Townsville in Queensland, which is seen as a Penny Wong had the killer line. It was Australia's worst foreign policy failing in the Pacific since World War II, and that's resonated a bit. It's certainly an issue, and it goes to this broader issue of competence and engagement from the Morrison government on foreign affairs. They're a big sort of chest-beating government. They signed the AUKUS agreement to provide nuclear technology for submarines with the US and the UK, turned their back on France, which they had a deal to buy some submarines from. This is big biggie in Australia. But I have been thinking about, and obviously climate change is a massive issue. I think we might talk about the teal stuff if we have time after this. But in trying to find the big issues, I really do think it's like almost everything goes by the wayside and it's just a referendum on Scott Morrison.
Right.
Because he's such a big figure and he's been like a figure of ridicule, a figure of hatred, but also such a strong figure during COVID at different times as well. In 2019, when he pulled off his miracle election when all the polls said he wouldn't, he didn't really have a record. He'd been in for less than a year. And now he's running on a record. And people were sort of only just tuning into him, finding out about him as Prime Minister when he was elected. And the iconic moment of his Prime Ministership, unless he gets elected again and goes on to do something else, will be when he went to Hawaii for a holiday during a time of big bushfires in Australia, and then he came back and retorted that he didn't hold a hose. There's horrible pictures of him going to bushfire-affected places and like trying to forcibly shaking people's hands when they didn't want him to do that. And that sort of manifested at different times the idea that he's been, asleep on the job or not a man of the people. It showed a lack of empathy during alleged rape and sexual assault allegations at Parliament. Slow with relief during the floods, and the COVID handling has been really up and down. He got a big bump when they closed the borders, the sort of kept everyone safe stuff that obviously powered Ardern to her 2020 victory. But in Australia, it wasn't so simple. He had to negotiate with states and do other things. And he was responsible for a couple of things, or the federal government was responsible for a couple of things: quarantine, and aged care, and vaccine procurement. And all three sort of were three of Australia's poorest, performed poorly on those levels. He said that getting vaccine wasn't a race, like record, scratch, freeze, frame. It was. and unfortunately, Australia's big death toll, a lot of that has come in aged care facilities. And the most recent one was at Christmas last year when Australia brought in the sort of compulsory rat testing. But Australia didn't have enough rats, so it actually ruined Christmas for a lot of people. I mean, you couldn't make up a more sort of toxic sort of environment for a politician. You had people either getting COVID because they're going to Christmas from their families, or not being able to go to Christmas events because they had COVID or couldn't test to show that they did or didn't. It was an absolute mess. But despite all that, he is an incredible campaigner. To watch one of his press conferences, to watch someone in full flight, he can bat away so many questions. He can change the debate. Which gives him a chance. He has a puncher's chance.
Are there debates? Are there televised debates?
There has been one. Sky News did a debate earlier. They're this sort of a pay TV channel that not many people actually see, but everyone sort of picks up the bigger points of it. I think only 200,000 people watched the debate, which is a bit unfortunate. And that was a sort of politics in the pub style event where they took questions from punters. You as undecided voters, and it came out narrowly. I think of the 100 people, it was 40 to 35 said Albanese won. There is going to be another debate. It's this weekend. It's on Channel 9, a free-to-air broadcaster. And it's quite funny if you follow the ABC, which is our public broadcaster. they're always saying we have invited Scott Morrison on. We've invited them to have a debate.
Right.
Or, we'd like to have more interviews. And they're so clearly scorned because they're getting a lot of no's. Yeah. They're getting a lot of rejections, which is bad for democracy. I mean, there should be debates, right? It's a great way of testing each other. But there's going to be one on this weekend, and I'd probably bet it would probably be the last one.
You talk about Sky News, which is in a way it's sort of a bit like the Twitter and of television, and as you say, like almost nobody watches it, but the rest of the media talk about it all the time, especially the left-leaning media, and the coalition spurning the ABC, the national broadcaster, and the Murdoch media obviously is really strong in Australia, and that seeps through. I don't know whether it's chicken or the egg to the political culture generally. What are your coming from New Zealand, where you're in the press gallery, so you get a particular sort of front seat view of it, almost literally, which may be distorted in its own way. But then going back to Australia and flicking on and watching the coverage there, how would you characterise that difference? It feels to me more when I check in with Australian politics and media, it seems to me more pugilist, more kind of more of a leap to a grunt and absolute kind of shirt front level castigation. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. It's a really hostile environment politically. I mean, it's one of the reasons that this reckoning Australian political culture and the Canberra bubble has had with its relationship to women has had such resonance, and there's been such awful stories come out. It's a brutal place to work, Canberra. Politics is played at 60 miles an hour. And it's also hostile to be a journalist. One of the reasons I love reporting in Wellington is it's a really kind and like ideas-driven landscape. I mean, I'm probably a bit I'm probably a bit optimistic and stuff. But even if you look at last week, I mean, David Parker came out with a tax speech. It was a very dry 60-minute speech about prospects in tax and how they wanted to find ways to explore and tax settings.
And data.
And data, yes, it was so dry. But it became one of the biggest issues in New Zealand for the last week. And it started a conversation about tax and about a wealth tax. And obviously, it was a genuine sort of policy affair. And as I understand it, Ardern's now ruled that out. But it was a contest of ideas there for a bit. I think Chloe and David Seymour went on One News this morning and had a bit of a debate about it. That sort of stuff just doesn't happen in Australia. It's not. It's like Australians and Australian politicians don't realise they have the power to change Australia or tweak Australia or make things fairer or better or however they want to do it. It's sort of just a business as she goes. Steady on the hand, sort of an affair. But the Murdoch media is a big part of it. But also, and I think this is understated, the power of the mining lobby in Australia. I mean, the last time Australian tried to genuinely fiddle with its tax settings as opposed to just change brackets or give some tax cuts was during Kevin Rudd's government when they tried to tax mining super profits. They tried to bring in a so-called carbon tax, as it was described ad nauseum by the coalition. And they were basically destroyed. People with any sort of mining constituency were lobbied to. It's been Scott Morrison brought a piece of coal into Parliament to show his bona fides with the mining industry. It's just we're best of friends apparently, but I just think we couldn't be any different when it comes to that.
So the influence of the mining lobby obviously joined the dots pretty quickly to what is often criticised as a lack of action on climate change, a lack of refusal to take it seriously over successive governments. You mentioned also women and the culture and a range of other issues around women in Australia, whether it's childcare, pay equity and so on. Those two issues, climate and women, are the centrepiece of a new, what's been called the teal wave. You touched on it earlier, but there are a group of teal independents, as they've been described, many of who literally using the colours teal, and those colours are obviously a mixture of the blue of the right and the green of the climate environmental approach. And these candidates, can you explain how it works? Because it's not a party, but they're getting support from a bankroller, but they're sort of becoming a real force, a real possibility of making a difference in the election coming up.
Yep. Yes. So I think possibility is the key word here. There has been some scattergun polling that suggests they're in the race, but we just don't know. It's sort of this is new in Australian politics. And it speaks to a failure by both major parties to deal with climate change and give Australians the climate change policy they want. And if you go back to brief sidebar, if you go back to 2007, the last time Labor won office from the coalition, people remember that as the work choices election. John Howard, who had governed for 11 years, proposed a remaking of the IR industrial relations system to give employers more. It was a union busting affair. And it was remembered as the work choices election, and the Labor Party, powered by the union movement, celebrated this great win over business or over the Liberals. But actually what the Australian electoral study showed was that climate change was the number one issue. I mean, Kevin Rudd came in promising to sign the Kyoto Protocol, which Australia hadn't done, to its great shame. You might remember An Inconvenient Truth, that Al Gore movie. It was Australia's number one issue. And since then, Australia just hasn't gotten on board. And hasn't taken the sort of steps. Like, we don't have an emission trading scheme like New Zealand does. Like, the very simple, easy thing. And business actually wants it. They want the climate change settings to plan for the future. They know a shift to renewables and the rest of it needs to happen. So out of this frustration comes the teal independence. Now, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but Simon Holmes Court is the entrepreneur that's sort of backing them, or at least organising this movement. And they've basically said that they will give money or support to candidates that have this mission, that are non-party aligned. And that's led to, and most of all, they're targeting, I'm not even sure it's targeting, it's just an organic movement in particular seats, depends on how cynical you are, people that, winnable seats in against the coalition. So, and that manifests in Kooyong which is the east of Melbourne, affluent part of Melbourne, against the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. And in Sydney, in the seat of Wentworth, a woman named Allegra Spender is taking on in Malcolm Turnbull's old seat, the smallest and richest seat in Australia, and North Sydney against another sort of moderate Liberal. And they're genuinely in with a chance. It's people power, it's enthusiasm, it's kick the old mob out. We're going to see how we go in a couple of weeks' time.
They're all wealthy metropolitan blue seats, aren't they? The Labor doesn't even figure in this conversation, which is fascinating in its own way. They're targeting directly the Liberal incumbents, almost all women, I think. And look, you're right. I mean, it's we don't want to be premature about this. It could be that one, maybe two get in. A wave may be overstating it, but would it be fair to say that probably the best case scenario for Morrison and the coalition, if you look at the polls now, would be a minority government, and Australia's had minority governments before. I think Gillard's was the last one, perhaps. But in that sort of situation, you have the crossbench, and if you have on that crossbench a group of teal independents, they have quite a lot of muscle in that arrangement.
Oh, totally. In 2010, when there was negotiation, it turned out to be three independents that had the final say. They took a week and they had drew up a list of plans, and it was a 17-minute speech that came down. It was the biggest thing Australia's ever seen. Of course, New Zealand goes through this almost every 3 years when you have the negotiations, the coalition negotiations. But they would have a lot. The teal independents would have a huge amount of power, and that's part of the allure as a voter. It's like, if climate change is an issue for me, I can make it the centre of the next government's agenda by voting for this mob, and at the same time registering a bit of a protest vote. I mean, it also speaks to disillusionment in the major parties. So back in 2007, 86% of Australians voted for a major party in the lower house. That's down to 75%. So now 1 in 4 people are looking around, and it does give rise to. It makes it harder for the major parties to get to 76 to get to majority government. So, and when you said before, in the best case scenario, I mean, I personally find it really hard to see Scott Morrison winning another majority, but you just can't rule it out given his campaign skill and what else. But go on. I think I've jumped to the conclusion a little bit early.
Go on then. Let's put it on you, Ben McKay. What is the definitive prediction, the official definitive Ben McKay prediction of what is going to happen on May 21?
I think that politics and government will be the winner, Toby. Oh. No, I think that it is very hard to see the Liberals getting a majority.
Yeah.
The mass of it, the Labor needs to flip, I think it is 5 seats to become the biggest party in Parliament and needs to flip 8 seats to become a majority. I think that's within reach. If you look at all the different polls in different states, there's a couple in Tasmania that might flip. There's 2 or 3 in Perth that should be easy enough, 1 in Adelaide, 1 in Victoria, and 1 in Queensland. But that sort of doesn't tell the story. The overall polls show a landslide to Labor, and when that sort of happens, unexpected seats flip as well, and they might get something in the 80s. But I mean, just like last time, the Labor leader is largely uninspiring, and people might have that switched around that Morrison has suggested. Why would you take the risk? It doesn't matter that they've had 3 different prime ministers in 9 years, and sort of the reform agenda is sort of flailing, and we've got a leader that wasn't there during major parts of Australia's tumult over the last few years. Maybe they don't want another tumult. It is a really difficult thing to predict. I mean, in 2020, when Ardern was on track, the sort of national vote is the only thing that matters, and everyone knew that it was going to happen for weeks out. But just because of the very regional nature, it is hard to call. Yeah, and Morrison's strategy also makes it a bit difficult as well, because through this awful Catherine Deves candidacy, who's a person who's made some pretty outrageous comments about trans people and gay surrogacy. Morrison is sort of dog whistling to the right in the hope of building a coalition around suburban seats and regional seats that might cost him the inner city seats, and that's a very narrow pathway, but he might have decided that's his way to victory. It can be both uninspiring, awful, but fascinating.
Has anybody sculled any schooners yet, or chomped directly through a raw onion, or any of the other kind of any budgie smugglers? I'm kind of looking for where is I haven't seen a lot of that. There've been a few gaffes, there've been a few good lines. There's been sort of a fair amount of mudslinging, but have we seen any budgie smugglers, any conspicuous alcohol consumption?
Mate, the well is dry. The tap has run out.
Oh, there's time.
It's hopeless.
I have faith in our Australian siblings to come up with something in the days to come.
Does my spin-off budget include, while I'm in Australia, getting amongst and sort of muckraking and sort of creating that sort of environment?
Oh yeah, I think you should go and grab some wombats and take them to a political debate and see what happens.
I'm willing to do it for the spin-off.
Thank you, Ben. It's been very illuminating and good to catch up. Enjoy your Tasmanian sojourn and the rest of your time in Australia. We'll see you back here soon.
Thanks, mate. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Ben McKay for getting up early in his Tasmanian idyll and giving us his time and insights. Thanks to producer Te Aihe Butler, to the Spin-Off Podcast Network Zar Jane Yee, and to you for listening all the way to the end. Ka kite anō.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.